Hi, mining community. Welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep, the mining podcast, the show that brings you latest insights, thought leadership, and stories from across the global mining industry. In today's episode, we had Matthieu Bos, who's the CEO of Falcon Energy Materials, who are advancing an anode material project in Morocco. He's also the chairman of Hercules Metals, a copper explorer in Idaho. His career spans battery materials, copper, gold, royalties, and complex jurisdictions from the DRC to Morocco, Quebec, and the United States. So in this conversation, we're going to explore how he thinks about building critical mineral projects, winning sophisticated capital, assessing jurisdictional risk, and where the mining industry needs to go next to turn supply chain ambition into real production. Matthieu, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. It's great to be on this podcast.
Yeah, appreciate your time. I know you do a lot of these podcasts, and I know you're an avid listener of this one also. So as we always start these off, just wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about your career, how you got into the industry, maybe from when you graduated, and how your career sort of developed to what it is today. So I'll hand it over to you now.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Look, I'm a trained mining engineer metallurgist, but I got scooped up by BMO Capital Markets quite early in my career and ended up working in London for the metals and mining team. I thought it was going to be a 1 or 2 year job, and then maybe I'll go back to Holland or where I'm from. But one thing led to the other, and one of the key clients at the bank was Robert Friedland. I got a chance to work on the Idaho Mines IPO, and later on, post-IPO, I got hired to go work for Idaho Mines, and that was an amazing journey. We had a lot of fun, some headaches to overcome, and after that, I regrouped with some friends and followers around what was called SRG, today Falcon Energy Materials, and that's where we are today. So it's been an interesting journey, but one that I enjoyed as well.
Great. I wonder if you just give us a snapshot of Falcon Energy Materials.
Yeah, thank you. Falcon is developing a anode material project in Morocco. Anode materials, for those who are not familiar with what that really is, the battery's got a positive side, which is called the cathode. The negative side is called the anode. A lot of people talk about cathode because that's where all the famous metals and materials like lithium and nickel and cobalt sit. But the anode is actually quite simple. It's basically graphite. And that's what we're focused on. We're exclusively focused on the processing of graphite. So we're no longer really in the mining business. We're really in the material sciences business, the transformation of graphite concentrate in what we call anode material. And that's what we're doing in Morocco. And we're proud to have a few very good backers, including La Mancha and large other pension funds and smart money out of the US. So this company is in good shape today.
As you mentioned, you're obviously developing an anode material project in Morocco. I suppose a jurisdiction not typically associated with battery materials. What drew you to Morocco, and what are the key technical and permitting challenges you're obviously having to navigate to get this into production?
Yeah. Look, Morocco is kind of hiding on Europe's doorstep, but it's actually a very important player in the battery materials and cell manufacturing industry. There's a lot of key players that have set up shop there, and more are coming. And the reason is that Morocco is kind of uniquely positioned because it's got a free trade agreement with the United States, and it's got a free trade agreement with Europe. But for those who read the newspapers today, they'll know that Europe and North America, and specifically the US, don't have a free trade agreement. So you can basically access both markets from one single point, which is quite unique. Then it's very well positioned kind of geographically. It's got excellent ports. And importantly, it's also got a lot of green energy, and it's got a very kind of supportive government that really wants to attract businesses like ours. And a lot of the key Chinese players are there, but a lot of the key European players have also set up shop there. So we think it's the right place to be. And on top of that, they are building a project that is going to give us feedstock for hydrofluoric acid, which is one of the key ingredients alongside graphite that we need.
You mentioned La Mancha, one of your investors.
Mhm.
That's obviously a serious note of confidence from one of the most sophisticated private mine investors in the world. What did you have to demonstrate to win, obviously, their backing? And what does it mean for the project trajectory?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, it's a vote of confidence. They invested, and I joined concurrently, so we were kind of doing this together from the very start. And I think when you look at La Mancha, look, traditionally they're a gold investor. They have had some forays in battery materials, but we're probably the platform that's left. And it's not a major investment. The fund is huge compared to the size of our investment, but the vote of confidence, as you point out, is critical for a project like ours. And I think how did we get it? I think first of all, they invest in projects that they think make economic sense, and secondly, they invest in people. And so we had a good board, we had good people around this company, and I think that ultimately got it over the line.
This episode is sponsored by Mining International. In today's market, finding the right mining talent isn't easy. Mining International works closely with mining companies to identify and secure senior and technical professionals through a tailored search approach. If you're hiring or exploring your options, you can contact Rob Tyson via the show notes to start a conversation today.
You're also obviously the chairman of Hercules Metals, who are an Idaho-focused copper explorer. Obviously, with copper demand fundamentals as strong as obviously they are, how do you think about building a copper story in the US, obviously in the US jurisdiction right now? Obviously, looking at regulatory environment, community relations, and timeline to production.
Yeah, look, it's obviously changing very rapidly, and there is accelerated permitting trajectories today in the U.S. that didn't exist a while back, and the demand for copper and the need for copper, specifically in the U.S. domestic production, is well documented. But the very first thing you should always ask yourself is when you go into a new venture is like, is the geology actually any good? And so we have the benefit of having really great geology too. And there is plenty of good places in the US to go look for copper, but you cannot you should never go for a project that is sub economical just because it is in the US. Like you have to go for where you have the best rocks, and coincidentally, we do have really great rocks in Idaho, so that's why it all makes sense. But if the rocks weren't good, I don't think we would do it, because then you're just playing off a geopolitical theme, which might make sense today, but in the long term, things go up and down. It might not always stay like that.
You spent a decade, nearly a decade at Ivanhoe Mines, helping close some of the largest strategic transactions in the industry, CGIN, and also $420 million streaming financing. What does it really actually take to get sophisticated institutional and strategic capital across the line on obviously complex mining projects? And what do junior companies consistently get wrong?
Well, let's start with the easier one. What did we get right? What does it take? I think when you first, the strategic capital will also follow the rocks. Whilst most of these investors are financial investors, like CITIC and others, in the end they do know a thing or two about mining, and they will only invest if the project really has scale, the geology is tier one, and so that's a starting point. Then, how do you really get, large strategic investors, and be it Chinese or from other jurisdictions? You've got to try to align the interests, right? So we always trying to make sure that there's room at the table for everyone, and that we try not to create too many conflicts. It's not always possible, but you got to try to make sure, like, that you meet everyone's objectives for sitting around that table, and that's not always easy. In Ivanhoe, we had Japanese partners, we had Chinese partners, we had large institutional investors from North America, and we had local partners like the Congolese government and the South African government. And so that was under the kind of guidance of Robert, obviously, a masterclass in aligning interests. Now, what did we get wrong? I think the hardest thing is to meet development timelines, right? So you might have the best geology, you might have supportive host government, you might have the money, but then something else happens, and you have to work through that. For instance, Kamoa-Kakula was built for a large part through COVID, and we did a good job. It's mostly the team on site, of course, that took the hardship for that. But so timing is everything, and meeting those timelines is probably the hardest part. For that, sometimes you have to make tough decisions.
Obviously, you mentioned in your introduction that you've got a metallurgy background. Then you moved obviously into corporate finance and business development. How does your technical grounding change the way you approach, obviously, deal making and investor conversations, particularly when you're pitching something as technically and specific as obviously anode materials?
Yeah, I think when it comes to metallurgy and where it's still used every day is you've got to try to understand what you're actually selling. So you're not selling a PowerPoint, you're selling the project that underpins that PowerPoint. And so I think investors take a great deal of confidence if you know at least more than they do. And for that, you have to have at times quite a good technical grounding, because some investors actually do ask some really pointed questions about why is this happening? Why is the mill not performing? And if you don't really understand why, you might not have to work in the mill yourself, but you have to be able to go and get the answer and understand it and explain it in often layman terms. I think this is where this interaction between a technical kind of background and day-to-day communication with investors and strategic partners is helpful. That you do know most of the time what you're selling. We don't have all the answers, but I think investors value that because it gives an element of comfort that somebody's got his finger at the pulse.
Obviously, battery materials and critical minerals are getting obviously enormous political attention, obviously,
Yeah.
right now. But the gap between policy rhetoric and what actually happens at the project level is obviously vast. Where do you see that disconnect most accurately? Um, and what needs to change to actually move the needle on Western supply chains?
So it's a complicated question because I think fundamentally what is not well understood is how rigid the supply chain really is, because we produce a product that has a very specific attributes, and that means it's really only suitable for a certain type of battery that is geared towards a certain end product. And so it's not so simple as say, oh, let's build 5 anode plants in the US or in Morocco or in Europe, because those anode plants fulfill a very specific role in the supply chain and are meant to produce a specific product that ends up in a specific battery that ends up in a specific car. And so you cannot just move the little Lego blocks around and say, so I make the analogy, this is like Savile Row bespoke tailoring. It will only fit one person. Well, maybe if you're lucky, you find somebody that is your mirror image and he happens to fit the suit. But really, it's very rare, and it's just we're making one product, which is generic, but it's bespoke for this specific client. And that is true up and down the whole value chain. And I think this is what is not well understood. It's not like little Lego blocks where you can just say, I'll take 3, and then at least I've got those 3. They're useless unless you have the whole chain.
You've obviously worked across DRC, Morocco, Idaho, Quebec, very obviously different jurisdictions with different risk profiles. What's your honest framework for evaluating jurisdictional risk? And are there places that the industry has bitten off too quickly or embraced too uncritically?
Yeah. Like political risk is something that you have to try to manage. Some things are unmanageable, so by and large, we try to stay apolitical. We don't really go one way or the other because the pendulum always swings even here in this country, right? And but there is security of title is very important, for instance. So it is very pleasant if you go to bed at night and you wake up the next morning that you still own the same asset as that you were owning that night before. And, for instance, a recent experience in Guinea where we were operating and we had a graphite project was one where the asset was taken away from us. that's disappointing, and it's an experience that I hadn't had before. We've had plenty of ups and downs in my career where things were difficult with government. We never outright lost an asset, and so this was very kind of sobering experience. And for me, that it would be very hard to go back to a country that has taken something away from you entirely. We work for our investors. We're a public company, and that security of title is what underpins everything. So, but pretty much everywhere else where at least the title is secure, we believe we can work.
Yeah. And did you learn any lessons from obviously the government taking away that asset?
Yeah, it's hard as we're in legal proceedings today against
Right.
the
Okay.
government, and we have announced a $100 million lawsuit. So I should not comment on it in too great detail. Um, it's not something that is unique, and it's not something that has only happened to us. I think there's lots of countries that have, at a point in time, um, gone down this route. It typically means that foreign capital dries up, unless the situation is remedied. And that's it's never too late. And to the extent that the Guinea government wants to find an amicable solution, they know where to find me.
Yeah. You've been involved in royalty companies, gold producers, base metals, battery materials. Is there a common thread in how you pick your battles? And what does the next 5 years in mining look like from when you're sitting?
How we pick our battles is a complicated one. In the end, sometimes you take on a job that turns out to be more work than what you originally set out to do. But by and large, what is most important is that you work with people that you enjoy working with. It's quite hard if it all becomes quite acrimonious and painful. And I think we've been lucky that we worked with throughout my career with a really good group of people. And so that's how we try to pick the battle. Because if you think, well, the project is great, but the people are not so great, that's kind of an uphill struggle. On the other hand, you should not just go hang out with mates and work on unviable projects either, just because they're your friends. So you have to try to find both. And for the next 5 years, I think we'll try and stick to that. It's a small industry. You know a lot of people in this industry, Rob, and for us, that's the most important. That we try to match up the best rocks with the best people, and if we keep doing that, maybe there's another project here in the next 5 years where we find the same, and we can build on that.
Yeah. Talking about people, how did you bring your team together? And obviously not necessarily just with Falcon Energy Materials, but the companies that you've worked in more recently. How have you brought the people to you? Obviously, people that I take it that you've known for a while.
Yeah. I think it's a complicated one because the market's quite hot, as you know, from your line of business as well, and so you have to offer something that that attracts talent. And so, for instance, in Falcon, what we offer is, I think we pay reasonably well, because if you underpay in this market, I think you're going to lose people pretty quickly. But pay is not everything. But second, what we offer is quite an interesting mix for a small company where we deal with real issues that are front page news at least once a week, cross border. Right. So if you can work for Falcon, you get to work from China through the UAE to Morocco and deal with some very, very high quality shareholders in the US and in Europe. So that's interesting because a lot of people don't have that exposure, so to speak. And so that's what we try to offer. And on top of that, I think we offer a kind of quite an entrepreneurial environment. So I try to minimize the number of forms people have to fill out. Actually, we never fill out a form. And as far as I'm concerned, your work's done for the day when you've actually completed all the tasks. And if you can do that in a shorter time frame than like 8 till 6, good for you. I might give you more work the week after. But in general, like it's not you don't clock in, you don't clock out. Like and that's what we try to kind of bring across every company, kind of an entrepreneurial, international, well compensated job.
And lastly, what's the short to medium term outlook for Falcon Energy Materials,
Oh,
sort of over the
yeah,
next 6 to 12 months?
Um, like my old boss had a very good saying, which I'll repeat because maybe it's not been said on this. Now we believe obviously you'll need a telescope to see the share price if we are successful in doing what we're set out to do, which is build the pilot plant, build the large plant for which we have pretty much all the money lined up now. And then look, it's not in our nature to have a single asset, single jurisdiction business. So we'll go and expand. Maybe we'll diversify the commodity mix. Maybe we'll diversify the geographical footprint. Maybe both. I don't think we're going to try to manage an empire from Australia to Chile and back with, the way I see it today. But if there are some logical things that we could acquire along the way that fit in our portfolio and have the same kind of riddles to solve between China, the West, supply chains, and we can redeploy some of the lessons that we learned, we will do it.
Matthew, really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing your
Pleasure.
story. Thank you for telling us a little about Falcon Energy Materials. And obviously wish you well in building the pilot plant. And obviously, hopefully that will be success to obviously then move on to building a
Yeah.
full scale plant in the future. So if our audience wants to reach out to you, obviously want to follow your story, ask you any questions, how can they go about doing that? And what social media platform channels are you on?
Yeah. We have plenty of social media platform, and I would just type in Falcon Energy Materials in Google or your favorite Claude agent. But otherwise, I'm old-fashioned. You can find me on m.boss@falconem.net.
We'll include those in the show notes accompanying this episode for easy access. So wish you well in the future. All those obviously challenges that you have in building a pilot plant, and I think you've probably overcome a lot of the recent challenges. But good luck in the future, and hopefully you'll be able to come on the podcast next year and give us an update.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank
No
you, Rob.
worries. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, appreciate your continued support. Please keep sharing these episodes far and wide. We obviously want to educate our mining industry, and obviously we're talking about obviously critical and battery minerals and metals, which is obviously going to play a major part in everyone's life moving forward. So appreciate your continued support. Please keep sharing these episodes amongst friends, family, and people within the industry. Thank you again for listening, and until next time, happy mining.